Hello, I'm Ruth Goodman, and today we'll be talking about daily life for medieval peasants. We'll confront the brutal realities of hunger, backbreaking labour, and the ever-present shadow of death that hung over ordinary people. We'll discuss what it really meant to survive in medieval England, from the moment you woke up to the moment you went to sleep, if you were lucky enough to make it through another day. Now, as everybody knows, medieval peasants were constantly starving to death, which of course is, well, actually that one's sort of true. I mean, they weren't dropping dead in the streets every single day, but hunger was your constant companion if you were an ordinary person in medieval England. Let me explain what I mean by that. This is what you're eating if you're a peasant: pottage. Now, if you've never heard of it, pottage is basically a thick stew, and I do mean thick. You're talking about something you could practically stand a spoon up in. It's made from whatever grain you've got: oats, barley, maybe a bit of rye if you're doing well, boiled up with water in your cooking pot. That's it. That's your breakfast, your dinner, and your supper, day in, day out, for most of your life. Now, on a good day, you might throw in some onions if you've got them growing in your little garden plot, maybe some cabbage. If you're very, very lucky and it's not Lent, you might have a bit of bacon fat to stir through it just to give it some flavour. But here's the thing, most days it's just grain and water. Porridge for breakfast, pottage for dinner, pottage for supper. And if the harvest was bad, well then you're watering it down even more, aren't you? Making it stretch, adding things like ground acorns or tree bark when you're truly desperate. The real killer wasn't that people were literally starving all the time, though that certainly happened in bad years. It's that they were chronically undernourished. You're working from dawn till dusk in the fields, doing the hardest physical labour you can imagine, and you're running on what amounts to thin gruel. Your body is constantly on the edge, you're tired all the time, you're vulnerable to every disease that comes along. And when a bad harvest hits, when the rains come and ruin the crops, or when there's a drought, that's when people really do start dying. There was one particularly grim period between 1315 and 1322, the Great Famine they call it now, when it rained and rained and rained. The crops rotted in the fields, people ate their seed grain, the grain they were supposed to plant for next year, because what else could they do? They were starving now. Chronicles from the time report people eating dogs, cats, even cases of parents abandoning children because they simply couldn't feed them. Can you imagine having to make that choice? Now let's talk about disease, because if hunger doesn't get you, disease probably will. And I'm not just talking about the Black Death, though we'll get to that in a moment. I'm talking about the everyday illnesses that could kill you stone dead. Here's what you need to understand about medieval medicine. It's not that people didn't try to help each other when someone got sick. They absolutely did. But they were working with ideas that were, shall we say, not quite right. The theory of the four humours, for example. The idea was that your body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and if they got out of balance, you'd get ill. So the treatment for pretty much everything involved trying to rebalance these humours. Got a fever? Well, that's too much blood, obviously. So let's bleed you. Literally, they'd cut your arm and let the blood drain out into a bowl, or they'd apply leeches to suck it out. Now, if you've got an infection and you're already weak, losing a pint of blood is probably the last thing you need, but that's what they did. The other popular treatment was purging, making you vomit, or giving you something to make you, how shall I put this delicately, evacuate your bowels rather violently, because that would supposedly get rid of the excess humours, you see. In reality, if you're already ill and dehydrated, this is likely to finish you off. There was also a charming practice called trepanning for headaches or mental illness, where they'd drill a hole in your skull to let out the bad spirits. Surprisingly, some people actually survived this, though goodness knows how. But here's the really frightening bit: basic hygiene. Now, medieval people weren't dirty in the way we sometimes imagine. They did wash, but they didn't understand germs. Nobody did. That knowledge wouldn't come along for another few hundred years. So you'd have the village well that everyone draws their water from, right next to the midden heap where everyone's throwing their waste. You'd have animals living in the house with you, chickens wandering about, a pig in the corner if you could afford one, because body heat, you see, everybody keeping everybody else warm. But that means you're living with animal waste as well. And then there's the Black Death, the plague that arrived in 1348 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of England. Just think about that for a moment. 1 in every 2 or 3 people you knew, dead within a year or two. Your neighbours, your family, your children. There are villages that were completely wiped out, just gone. The church still standing, but not a soul left alive to attend it. The thing about the plague is that nobody knew what caused it. They thought it might be bad air or divine punishment or the alignment of the planets. So people tried everything, prayer obviously, that's your first resort, carrying posies of flowers to ward off the bad smells, which is where Ring Around the Rosie supposedly comes from, though that's probably Victorian nonsense. Some people flagellated themselves, whipping their own backs bloody in the streets, thinking God would spare them if they punished themselves first. Nothing worked, of course, because it was fleas on rats spreading bacteria, but they didn't know that. All they knew was that people were dying in the most horrible way, swellings in the groin and armpits, fever, delirium, and then death, often within days. And if someone in your house got it, you probably did too, because you were all sleeping in the same room, weren't you? So let's talk about where you're sleeping, because that's another thing that might surprise you. This is what an ordinary peasant's house looked like, and I use the term house generously. We're talking about 1 room, sometimes 2 if you're doing quite well, but usually 1. It's made of wood frames filled in with wattle and daub, that's woven sticks covered in a mixture of mud, straw, and often animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. The walls of your house contain cow poo. It's actually quite good insulation as it happens, but it does mean that when it rains heavily, your walls can literally start to dissolve. The floor is earth, packed earth, yes, but still just dirt. You might throw down some rushes or straw to make it a bit more comfortable, but that's it. And in this 1 room, you've got the whole family, mother, father, children, and often grandparents too if they're still alive, which they probably aren't because life expectancy is, let's be honest, terrible. You're all sleeping together in this 1 room. There might be a sort of raised platform at one end for the adults, a bed of sorts, but the children are on the floor, probably on straw mattresses if you're lucky, or just piles of straw if you're not. And remember those animals we mentioned? They're in here too at night. The pig, the chickens, maybe a goat if you've got one, because you can't leave them outside. Someone might steal them. They're too valuable. And also, again, warmth. Everything is about staying alive through the winter. Privacy, what's that? There is no privacy. There is no separate bedroom for the children. There is no bathroom. You've got a bucket in the corner, or you go outside to the latrine, which is basically a hole in the ground with a wooden seat over it if you're fancy. And the smell. Oh my goodness, the smell. You've got smoke from the fire. There's no chimney in most peasant houses. It just filters out through a hole in the roof or through the thatch, so the whole place is constantly smoky. You've got unwashed bodies because washing is hard when you have to carry every drop of water from the well. You've got animal waste. You've got the contents of that chamber pot. You've got damp thatch, mildew, rotting straw on the floor. It would be absolutely eye-watering to our modern noses. But here's the thing. You're born into this, so you don't know any different. This is just normal life. This is what existence is. And the main thing, the overwhelming thing, is that it's cold and it's dark. You've got 1 fire for heating and cooking, and fuel is precious. You can't just leave it burning all day. You have to gather every stick of firewood yourself. So you're cold a lot of the time. And you've got no glass in the windows, obviously. Glass is for rich people. You've got wooden shutters, but if you close them to keep the cold out, you can't see anything because you've got no artificial light, except maybe a rushlight, which is basically a reed soaked in fat that you light. It gives off about as much light as a candle, costs precious fat to make, and smoke, more smoke. So in winter, you're basically going to bed when it gets dark, because what else are you going to do? You can't see to work, you can't afford the light to stay up, so you just get into bed at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and try to stay warm until morning. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't often get discussed, and that's the sheer randomness of death in this period, because it's not just hunger and disease, though those are bad enough. It's the fact that the most ordinary things could kill you. Childbirth, for example. If you're a woman in medieval England, you have about a 1 in 3 chance of dying in childbirth at some point in your life, because you're going to have a lot of children. That's just what happens when you have no birth control and you're married young. And every single time you're rolling the dice. Will the baby come out properly? Will you bleed to death afterwards? Will you get an infection? There's a midwife there, yes, and she's probably delivered dozens of babies, but she's working with her hands and some herbal remedies and a lot of prayers. If something goes seriously wrong, you're probably dead, and quite possibly the baby is too. Accidents at work. You're ploughing a field and the plough tips over on you. You're thatching a roof and you fall off. You're working with sharp tools every single day. Scythes, axes, knives, and one slip could mean you're bleeding out in a field somewhere. And even if the injury itself doesn't kill you, the infection afterwards probably will, because again, no concept of germs, no antibiotics, just hoping for the best. Even a simple scratch could kill you. I'm not exaggerating. You get a thorn in your finger while you're hedging, it gets infected, the infection spreads up your arm, and suddenly you've got blood poisoning and you're dead within a week. Things that we'd treat today with a plaster and maybe some antiseptic cream were death sentences in the Middle Ages. And then there's violence. We think of the Middle Ages as this time of chivalry and knights and honour, but for ordinary people, violence was just part of life. You get into a dispute with a neighbour over where your field ends and his begins, it turns into a fight, someone pulls a knife, and suddenly you're on trial for murder. Or more likely you're just dead because he got you first. There were records kept by coroners. Yes, they had those in medieval times, and they make for absolutely fascinating reading. John Smith fell into a ditch while drunk and drowned in 3 inches of water. Alice Brown was kicked by a horse and died instantly. Robert Jones was murdered by persons unknown on the road to market. It's the casual nature of it that's so striking. Death is just everywhere, all the time, for the most mundane reasons. And let's not forget about the law. If you're accused of a crime, you might face trial by ordeal. That's where they make you hold a red-hot iron bar or plunge your hand into boiling water, and then they bandage it up and check in 3 days to see if it's healing cleanly. If it is, God has shown you're innocent. If it's infected, which it probably will be because, burns, then you're guilty and you'll be hanged. Or if you're a woman accused of being a scold, that's nagging your husband, they might put you in the ducking stool and plunge you into the river until you nearly drown, just to teach you to shut up. The whole system is designed around the idea that life is cheap, particularly if you're poor. You're expendable. There are always more peasants to work the fields. If you die, someone else takes your place. That's just how it is. So why am I telling you all this? Why are we dwelling on the miserable parts? Because I think it's important to understand what ordinary life really meant for most people in history. We have this romanticised view of the Middle Ages, sometimes the pretty dresses, the castles, the knights in armour, but for 90% of the population, life was short, brutal, and filled with suffering, where the average life expectancy for a peasant was probably somewhere around 30 to 40 years. Now, that's partly because so many children died. If you made it past age 5, your chances improved somewhat. But even then, very few people lived to what we'd consider old age. If you saw your 50th birthday, you were genuinely ancient, and you probably looked it too, because decades of hard labour and malnutrition had worn your body down to nothing. And yet, and this is important, people still lived. They still loved each other. They still got married, had children, celebrated feast days, told jokes, sang songs. They made the best of what they had, because what else could they do? You can't just give up and die because life is hard. You keep going because that's what humans do. There was joy in this world too, don't get me wrong. A good harvest was a time for celebration. Getting through the winter was a triumph. A wedding, a baby being born healthy, a saint's day with a bit of extra food and maybe some dancing, these were bright spots in an otherwise difficult existence. But we shouldn't romanticize it, we shouldn't pretend it was better than it was. For medieval peasants, life was a constant struggle against hunger, disease and death, and more often than not, death won. Next time, we'll be looking at how medieval peasants tried to find moments of happiness and celebration in spite of everything, and what their rare leisure time actually looked like when they got any.